As we find ourselves on the brink of another holiday season, a time to gather with family, for many of us, a time to grapple with challenging relationships and interactions we will find there, I've built today's service upon a foundation of Dr. Murray Bowen's family systems theory. I've done this most November since I've been the minister here for certainly more than a decade because I believe from my own experiences, family systems theory has a lot to offer us in our attempts to better understand the complexity of human relationship and our participation in them. In the light of my theology, a theology in which the divine is made real through the encounters that we have, where we choose to see ourselves and those in our lives with clear eyes and open hearts, I think there are a few pursuits that could be considered more spiritual or holy than better understanding our relationships and learning how to function more effectively within them. Murray Bowen was a psychiatrist who, before he died in 1990, spent over 40 years developing a theory of human behavior that aimed to objectively describe human interaction, not as it could be or should be, but as it is. Bowen saw that the predominant way that people tried to understand human behavior was typically based in human subjectivity. In other words, one person's experience was interpreted by that person, and sometimes by the person's therapist, an approach based in the belief that the basic unit of how we function emotionally is the individual. If an individual has a problem, the traditional approach says, undoubtedly some individual is to blame. Could be one's mother or one's father, one's sibling, or oneself. Bowen sought to escape this inherently subjective cause and effect symptom-based approach, believing that it is too centered on blame and guilt and on attempts to diagnose other people. It obscures the inherent strength and resilience of the human animal, and it does not take into full account the ways in which people really interact. So the theory he developed then took the emphasis off the individual and focused instead on the entire family as an emotional unit of itself, a system where each individual member holds a functioning position and contributes to the working of the whole. Bowen believed that if a symptom or a problem is evident in only one person, an emphasis on fixing or helping that one person alone would always be misguided because it's the whole system, meaning the entire multi-generational family itself and not just a single individual that has inevitably contributed to and or enabled any symptom that emerges. In other words, in order for a symptom in a person to be alleviated, the system itself has to change. There are many components to this theory. The most important for our time together this morning are two. They are differentiation and multi-generational transmission process. I'm going to tell you a few words about differentiation, and then I'll get on to this transmission process. And I hope I'll give you enough background so you start to kind of grasp what he's talking about here. First, differentiation. Bowen theory proposes that each of us holds a unique place on a hypothetical continuum of differentiation, a place that corresponds with our ability to maintain our functioning in the midst of an anxious system, or in other words, our ability to handle and adapt to stress. Differentiation is similar in some respects to what we might call emotional maturity, but differentiation is actually a much broader concept because it factors in your health, your intelligence, and your social skills. The theory says that the level of an individual's differentiation is equivalent to the degree to which she can define her own life goals and values as separate from those of others. The more differentiated a person is, the greater her capacity to communicate with I statements, as in I feel, I believe, especially when everyone else around her is using you and we statements, as in you need to change, or we miss the old you. The more differentiated a person becomes, the greater his capacity to take responsibility for his own destiny and emotional well-being, even in the face of panic or crisis. At the risk of oversimplifying the differences on these various points on the differentiation continuum, I will tell you that people at higher levels tend to have more success in their vocations and in their relationships. They're able to function more readily out of their principles and they have more freedom to choose their responses to anxiety than those who are at lower levels of differentiation may have. They have behavior patterns that tend to be less involuntary and less provoking of intense emotions. Now, when you think of people in your life who are the most thoughtful under stress, who seem to be able to navigate difficult situations without sacrificing their principles or acting out in ways that are adding emotional intensity to the mix, you're probably thinking of people who are more differentiated than most. Now, before you go beating yourself up for how undifferentiated you assume you are, know there is no promised land of complete differentiation where once we arrive, all our family relations are going to be easy and pain-free. Each of us, no matter how differentiated we may be, can and will be drawn into the muck of family emotional process at times and find ourselves just as reactive as anyone else. All that we can try to do is to be mindful of our behavior patterns and triggers, taking note of when we have fallen into a trap of emotional reactivity. When I say emotional reactivity, I can talk about what it feels like to me, and those are the times when my statements and actions betray my true intentions or lead me away from what I would want were I not being so reactive. Developing this capacity to be mindful, to see what we are doing as we do it, will not eliminate or protect us from our reactivity, but it could aid us in seeing a possibility for a more thoughtful approach to the stress of our families and our lives in them. The theory says that each of us can, through a blend of conscious effort, practice, and interaction with highly differentiated people, increase our own levels of differentiation in small, though significant ways. Still, for the most part, our level of differentiation has been set by our family of origin before we even leave home for the first time. Or, as you may have heard, our families know how to flip our triggers because they are the ones who installed them. But it's not just our immediate families who installed them. This installation has been happening over generations. Family systems theory assumes that individual differences in functioning and differentiation are reflections of a logical and predictable relationship process, one that links family members who have never even met. This is what Bowen called multi-generational transmission process, and he viewed it as one of the most important concepts in his theory. This process occurs through relationships with the extended family and carries forward emotions and attitudes and behavior patterns and values from one generation to the next. This process is predictable because only a few patterns of emotional functioning have emerged in nuclear families throughout history. In fact, the patterns of today are believed to be the same ones that existed hundreds, even thousands of years ago. We haven't really changed that much over time. When an emotional problem surfaces in a family, one or more of three basic patterns of emotional functioning become bound into the family relationships to handle the stress. So when things are getting heightened in your family, it's usually going to be exposed in one or more of three ways. Conflict between the parents or the partners, one partner over or under functioning. That's what I mean, like when one person takes on too much or too little responsibility for the relationship in an attempt to maintain harmony, or at least one of the couple's children becomes the focus of the parent's anxiety. Despite how these problems are played out in one generation, whatever takes place will have nearly inevitable consequences for generations to follow. Therefore, the intensity of emotionality in the new generation will have been significantly influenced by the emotion of previous generations. And this is why, as we consider this month in our Soul Matters groups and services, what it means to be a people of ancestry, we would do well, I think, to reflect upon the legacy of emotional process in our ancestors. The emotional process has a lot to do with our own levels of differentiation, our own capacity to be solidly ourselves when things get crazy, even in the midst of our current day family anxiety. The way this multi-generational transmission process works is actually pretty simple. If we were to begin with a couple in love, a theoretical first generation, Systems thinking enables us to assume that these two people are going to have the same basic level of differentiation, or else they would not have been attracted to one another in the first place. I find this to be a fascinating component of Bowen theory, that we are attracted to people with the same level of differentiation that we have, because couples often assume that one partner functions at a much higher level than another, right? Come on now. When in reality, the observed differences in function are more a product of over-functioning by one partner and under-functioning by another, a kind of reciprocal balancing act that's employed to manage stress. So those of you who are currently in committed relationships who may be feeling the need to improve the functioning of your partner, beware! You might be better served by focusing on your own functioning in the system. Rather than trying to change them, you will want to consider how you might be able to change yourself. Back to our first couple. These two mates now become the primary architects of the nuclear family emotional atmosphere, and each child raised in that family is incorporated into the climate. Think of your own family of origin. You as a child in the system, at least initially, had no way of knowing what aspects of the family's way of relating were dysfunctional, did you? In other words, the ways the family's interactions inhibited the growth of each member's differentiation. You were simply inculcated into the parent's emotional process, for better or for worse, right? The functionality of the family system that emerges is equivalent in large part to the initial level of differentiation in the two parents, as well as by mostly random external pressures that any family would face that would produce anxiety, things like illness, economic hardship, tragedy. Whatever anxiety the family does endure, it gets bound into one of those previously mentioned emotional patterns: marital conflict, over or under functioning in a spouse, the impairment of one of the children. In other words, one or more of the children ends up carrying the symptoms of the family's anxiety by acting out or receiving too much or not enough parental focus. The ways in which the family's anxiety is managed or not directly impacts the level of differentiation of each of the kids. Later, when these children find their own mates, they will, just as their parents did, choose partners with essentially the same differentiation that they have, and so on and on. The transmission process continues. Of course, there are variances over time based on internal and external pressures, as well as the degree of support that each successive generation receives. And these variances create trends in family functioning that can be charted over several generations. Trends that, once observed, can inform future generations in significant ways. I'm going to say more about this in a few minutes, but first I want you to hear a song. Kind of change your thought now. We're going to go to music for a few minutes. And this song reflects one man's observation of his own family's multi-generational transmission process, though he doesn't call it that, and his attempt at differentiation, standing for self, in the midst of an anxious system. It's a message delivered to a grandfather by his son on behalf of his grandson.
The rage from your past slammed into you hard and fast, made you hit my child who was defenseless. And right then I cut free all the ties you had to me, for to drag down one more life would just be senseless. I saw in my son's eyes the old confusion and surprise that I once felt when you would roar like thunder. Now I don't care to hear the tale of how your history made you fail, or the cruel iron fist you grew up under. 'Cause now you can't get through. I'm standing right between you two, for love has made me stronger than the fear. And my son shares your name, but this is where I'll break the chain. So I will warn you once and make it clear. You rage again and we will disappear. Your father's chain of anger stops right here. Right here. So now I can see the way it must have been for me as I tear down the facade of your excuses, and what's left of you is hard to see but must be true. I don't need to hide from what the truth is, but the times that were the best are now sinking down with all the rest. 'Cause when you crossed that line is when you lost me. I know your hate will pull you down. To hold to you would make me drown. I have to break your grip, though it will cost me. So now you can't get through. I'm standing right between you two. For love has made me stronger than the fear. And my son shares your name, but this is where I'll break the chain. So I will warn you once and make it clear. You rage again and we will disappear. Your father's chain of anger stops right here.
Now, I like how this song captures the tension of the father as he makes a dramatic stand for his son, and perhaps equally important, for himself. Even as I appreciate the song, particularly the acknowledgement of the rage of the grandfather is something that is not his alone, that it's part of a chain that has been passed down from his father and the fathers of generations before, I'm not sure the song offers a completely effective example of a Bowen approach to the situation. You see, my concern is that the emotionality of the father's approach to define self, particularly the demanding, threatening tone that the father employs as he tells the grandfather to change or else we will disappear. Now, I'm not advocating that people in the midst of physically abusive families should keep subjecting themselves to abuse. However, my understanding of Bowen theory suggests that the father's stand, in this case, might be just as emotionally driven as the grandfather's rage. And that even if the father thinks he's breaking the chain of anger, he may just be twisting it into a new shape, one that is still based in reactive anger, and one that could eventually end in what Bowen would call emotional cutoff. You know, you rage again and we will disappear, like you're never going to talk to me again. That's what Bowen called emotional cutoff, and it's potentially the least helpful response possible, because the cutoff will impact the grandson too, right? As the boy will then be triangulated, don't talk to your grandfather anymore. Inevitably triangulated into the ever-simmering conflict between the two men, and therefore, in some ways, the anxious energy behind that chain of anger will be as strong as ever. Nevertheless, I wanted you to hear the song, because I think it shows how easy it is to be pulled into the multi-generational emotional system, and how challenging it can be to make a self-differentiated stand within our families of origin. It's complicated, right? So how in this world of Bowen theory, where it seems we are inextricably connected to the ingrained emotional process of those who have come before us, can we possibly improve our own level of differentiation and functioning within the families of our lives? After all, according to Bowen, we will almost always tend to replicate the lifestyle we learned in our family of origin in all of our future relationships. Wow, it's such a bummer, right? Does that mean that each of us is destined to repeat the same mistakes that other members of our families of origin have made? And that we will make these mistakes both within and outside of our families? Well, perhaps. Sort of. We certainly are influenced by the relationship patterns of our family of origin, which were influenced by the patterns of their families that came before them. But the good news is that we can learn from the good stuff of our extended families too. It's not all bad, as most every family system has at least some degree of healthy differentiation. And here's some more good news. Each day, we have the opportunity to observe the emotional patterns and habits of our families and to make incremental changes in that system, both for ourselves and for the future, simply by working on our own functioning in the system. How we relate to our family members, how we relate. Each small change we can make has the possibility of opening up the new world of a different lifestyle for others, not only for ourselves and for the generations to follow. We can, as the David Wilcox song suggests, break the chain, or at least do our small part toward that end by observing our own contributions to emotional patterns and by doing our best to practice and apply some more thoughtful approaches to family anxiety. Bowen claimed that the crucial point in making these changes possible is when we can begin to recognize the difference between our emotion-based behavior, that's when we're reactive or we distance or we cut off, we overfunction, we underfunction. This helps us to see the multi-generational family as a living organism that can be a source of wisdom for us if we can only garner enough gumption up to explore it. I love this, with the objective approach of a scientist. If we can look at our families like we're studying them, to metaphorically remove ourselves the best we can from the emotional dance floor of our families, it's nearly impossible. But if we're trying, we might see something we didn't see before. If we can remove ourselves from the emotional dance floor of our families, especially our most challenging interactions, and get up on the balcony. See, one way a Bowen theory follower can gain access to the balcony, to look down at how people are reacting and relating, is by creating a family diagram that would map out each individual's place in the family over several generations. A lot of you have done genealogy work. You're way ahead of this game. See, along with these places in the family, important historical facts about each person, such as health and career, educational achievement, marital status, and so on, as well as emotional facts regarding the family history of conflict, cutoff, distance, and violence. Once you have this laid out in front of you, the information can reveal trends and patterns that will magnify or explain our own emotional tendencies and patterns and those of the remaining family. And that will help us become more objective, even when the system is anxious, just knowing how everybody has related over the generations. In other words, chances are good that the emotional patterns of the past are still being lived out in some important ways in the patterns of the present. Not all the information needed to complete the diagram will be easily accessible. Many family members may no longer be alive. However, the detective work that is necessary to create a diagram like this, to begin to know and understand the stories at the heart of our family's history, is just as important as the diagram itself, because the project will compel us to have intentional contact with many, if not all, extended members of the family system. This would be a revolutionary step for most of us. Bowen said, if you can get a one-to-one relationship with each living person in your extended family, it will help you grow up more than anything else you could ever do in life. A one-to-one relationship, I'm not talking about, being available to every emotional whim of our extended family or even scheduling frequent face-to-face visits. One-to-one relationships can be achieved through an occasional phone conversation or a letter or an email. Basically, any communication that keeps us from being totally cut off from our family and reminds us that we are connected branches of the same family tree, whether we like it or not. Even as Bowen emphasized maintaining one-to-one contact with each member of one's extended family as a way to increase self-knowledge and, in turn, one's level of differentiation, he also made it clear we should not make contact with members of our family with the mission of doing therapy on them or helping them by sharing our newfound pearls of systems thinking wisdom. For example, I'm not encouraging you to visit with your sister this Thanksgiving and explain to her how she could help the functioning of the family if she would work on being less anxious. I'm not suggesting that you try to explain to your dad how his persistently belligerent attitude leads to family tension and negatively impacts the system. Talk about throwing fuel on the fire. The system won't stand this kind of diagnosis, nor will your sister or your dad. This approach, what I would call the you need to chill out or change approach, is the exact opposite of systems thinking because it's based in blame. It's assuming that one person is the toxic element causing all the problems, when in reality, the whole system is enabling the tension and furthering the anxiety. So if you find yourself wanting to tell your sister or your father or your aunt or your son to chill out or change this holiday, remember, more likely than not, you are probably the one who needs to chill out. You are probably the one who needs to change her functioning in the family. You are probably the one who needs to manage your own anxiety. However you can do that, meditation, walking away for a few minutes, I don't know, finding somebody to talk to. That's not to say the family member that flipped your trigger won't be doing something annoying or perplexing. It's just to remind you once again of the key to a Bowen theory balcony view approach. The only way we can improve our functioning of the family is to work on ourselves, to manage our own anxiety the best we can, to try to stay in calm contact with family members, doing our best to relate to the family while limiting our reactions to their reactions. We don't have to like everybody in our extended family. We don't have to create or recreate deep relationships with family members we simply don't enjoy being around or who we think are dangerous or damaging to who we are. This theory does not suggest that we punish ourselves like that. Instead, it encourages us to keep it as simple and consistent as we can, taking what we can learn from each family contact we make and maintain, and encouraging to think of ourselves as scientists examining pieces of our histories and emotional landscape, monitoring our own anxiety in the midst of family flare-ups, consulting with our family diagrams as the maps to treasure that they can truly be, the treasure of seeing the living, dynamic organism that is our multi-generational family as a means by which we can ground ourselves in something deeper than accusation and blame, moving instead toward a more realistic way of being in the world, the real world, a world where no one is perfect, where no family is perfect, where each of us struggles for love and acceptance, peace, understanding, and forgiveness, sometimes against great odds. Won't you join me in a spirit of prayer? O Spirit of life, creative, imperfect source of all families, we know you, Spirit of our living, when our family connections bring us joy. We also know you when these same connections bind us up inside with anger and disappointment and resentment. Sometimes we look at our families and we wish for happier times, or maybe times that never were, but we long for anyway. We look at our families, whether in person or in our mind's eye, and we yearn for peace, forgiveness, and redemption, even as we may tell ourselves it's a lost cause. Will we ever know why our families are so maddening? Is it possible to be grateful for them, even in our disappointment, even in our frustration? Thank you, Spirit of life, human possibility in action, for the opportunity to live one more day with these people who drive us crazy, even as they lift us up. These people who challenge us to be authentically ourselves, even as they work consciously and unconsciously against our attempts to do so. And teach us in all the families of our lives to see beyond the flare-ups and the failures, the maladies and the meltdowns, and to find the peaceful stillness beneath the surface, the stillness from which we came and to which we will all one day return. Amen.